The air in the Providence Gulch Town Hall on October 5th, 1876, was thick with the scent of pine smoke, wet wool, and a creeping communal fear. Outside, a premature autumn snow fell, not the gentle dusting of years past, but a heavy, wet blanket that clung to the barren branches of the aspens and muted the world in an oppressive white. The men of the settlement, their faces grim and chapped by the wind, sat on rough-hewn benches, their gazes fixed on Mayor Thompson. He was a man whose authority rested on the twin pillars of a booming voice and an unshakable confidence in traditional methods. Both were beginning to fail him. The problem was simple, stark, and deadly. The Great Fire of late July had consumed nearly a third of the valley's accessible timber, the very wood they depended upon for building, for cooking, and most critically, for heating their homes through the long, brutal mountain winters. What remained was green, difficult to haul, and wholly insufficient for the 27 families huddled in the gulch. Their log cabins, the pride of their labor and the symbols of their conquest over the wilderness, were notoriously inefficient. They were designed to be fed a constant, gluttonous diet of seasoned hardwood, a resource they no longer possessed. "We will ration," Mayor Thompson declared, his voice echoing slightly in the tense silence. "Each family will receive an allotment from the communal woodpile. We will fell what green timber we can, but it will burn poorly. We must be frugal. We must be hardy. It will be a difficult winter, but we are pioneers. We have faced hardship before." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they landed like stones in the pit of every stomach. They all knew what frugal meant. It meant waking to frost on their blankets. It meant huddling around a single, sputtering fire. It meant sickness for the old and the young. It meant death. It was then that a figure rose from the back of the hall. The men turned, their expressions a mixture of surprise and mild irritation. It was Alara Vance. She was a slight figure, made to look even smaller by the drab gray dress she wore. The town knew her story well enough to feel a detached pity for it. Her parents had been taken by fever 5 years prior. Her husband, a young trapper named Daniel, had been lost to a rock slide just the year before, leaving her a widow at the age of 19. She lived alone on the small plot of land her grandfather had staked out decades ago, a parcel most considered undesirable, situated on a steep, south-facing slope at the valley's edge. She was 20 years old. "Mayor Thompson," she began, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the nervousness a young woman ought to feel when addressing the town's assembled patriarchs. "Rationing will not be enough. The laws of thermodynamics do not bend for piety or pioneer spirit. The heat loss from our cabins is too great. The fuel supply is too small. The math is absolute." A low murmur went through the crowd. The word thermodynamics sounded foreign and academic on her tongue, an affront to the practical, hands-on knowledge they valued. Silas Croft, a man whose primary contribution to the community was a steady stream of unsolicited opinions, scoffed audibly. "And what would you know of such things, Alara? This is men's business, matters of engineering and logistics." Alara's gaze did not waver. She held a worn, leather-bound journal in her hands. "I know what my grandfather taught and what he wrote in his books. He was a student of the earth. He understood that we fight the winter when we should be embracing the ground." She stepped forward, her earnestness a stark contrast to the cynical exhaustion in the room. "We build our houses high, exposing 4 walls and a roof to the wind and the cold, requiring a constant battle of fire against air. It is a wasteful design, a design of arrogance. There is a better way to build a winter house, a sunken hearth, that requires a fraction of the fuel." She opened the journal, revealing pages filled with meticulous diagrams and elegant script. We excavate. We build into the earth, using the ground itself as insulation. The planet's thermal mass is constant. A few feet below the frost line, the Earth maintains a stable temperature, between 45 and 55 degrees. Our enemy is not the cold, it is the wind and the air. By sinking the house, we eliminate 3/4 of the battle. We build a single, steeply angled southern wall of glass to capture the low winter sun. Passive solar gain. The light enters, warms the stone and earthen floors, and that heat is radiated back throughout the day and night. It is a heat trap. A sun catcher. She paused, looking at their blank, uncomprehending faces. My grandfather's calculations show a structure like this can be kept at a comfortable temperature all winter with less than half a cord of wood. I have a plan to build one on my property. I believe it is the only viable solution for the town. The silence that followed was heavier than the snow outside. It was a silence of profound, collective disbelief. Finally, it was broken by the dry, rasping chuckle of Mr. Abernathy, the town's most respected builder. He was a man in his 60s, with hands like gnarled oak roots and a face that seemed carved from the very timber he worked. He had built nearly every cabin in the gulch. Alara's proposal was not just an idea, it was an indictment of his life's work. A hole in the ground? Abernathy said, shaking his head slowly, a condescending smile playing on his lips. Child, you are describing a root cellar, not a home for Christian folk. People don't live in holes like groundhogs. It would be damp. It would be dark. The roof would collapse under the snow. It is the fanciful dream of an old man who, forgive me for saying so, always was a bit peculiar, and a young girl, lost in her grief. It would not be damp if properly ventilated, Alara countered, her voice firm. A high vent on the north wall and a low intake on the south creates a natural convection current. It would not be dark. The entire southern face is glass, making it brighter than any of our cabins. And the roof, a shed design with a steep pitch, would be stronger than a conventional peak and shed snow naturally. It is all in the design. Mayor Thompson held up a hand, his patience clearly exhausted. Alara, we appreciate your concern, truly. But we must deal with reality, not with sun catchers and holes in the ground. We will stick to what we know. Sturdy log walls, a good stone hearth, and a tight roof. We will manage. This discussion is closed. The finality in his tone was absolute. The men turned away from her, their shoulders set with the grim determination to follow a familiar path, even if it led off a cliff. Not one of them had lost a parent to fever and a husband to the mountains in the span of 5 years. Not one of them had spent countless solitary nights reading books on geology and engineering by candlelight. And not one of them, as they filed out of the hall to face the coming winter, would admit that the quiet girl in the gray dress had presented a solution based on logic, while they were clinging to a tradition based on pride. Alara Vance stood alone, the journal held tight to her chest. She had offered them a lifeline. They had mistaken it for a ghost story. The next morning, on October 6th, the snow had stopped, leaving a pristine and deceptive beauty over the valley. The cold, however, remained. It was a deep, biting cold that promised worse to come. Alara did not waste time on bitterness. The town's rejection had been a foregone conclusion in her mind, a necessary formality. Her true work began now. She took stock of her resources. From Daniel, she had a set of well-maintained tools, a heavy pickaxe, a broad-headed shovel, a sturdy wheelbarrow with a solid oak frame, a crosscut saw, a hammer, and an adze. From her parents, she had the land and the small, drafty cabin she now occupied. And from her grandfather, she had the journals and a small, heavy leather pouch containing $47 in silver coins. It was her entire worldly wealth. She spent the morning in focused preparation, not with wood or stone, but with string and stakes. She walked the chosen site on the south-facing slope below her existing cabin. The location was perfect, shielded from the prevailing northwesterly winds by a thick stand of pine and a granite outcrop. The ground sloped at a gentle 15 degrees, ideal for the design. With meticulous care, she measured and staked out the perimeter of the excavation. It was to be 24 feet long, running east to west to maximize southern exposure, and 12 feet wide. Her grandfather's notes were specific. The back northern wall would be excavated to a depth of 8 feet, while the front southern wall would be only 4 feet deep, creating a floor that sloped gently down into the earth. At noon, she ate a meager lunch of bread and dried apples. Then she picked up the pickaxe. The ground was hard, a dense mixture of clay and stone. The first swing of the heavy tool sent a jarring shock up her arms. The second and third were no different. This was not the soft loam of a garden bed. This was a stubborn, unyielding opponent. For the rest of the day, she worked with a rhythmic, relentless pace. The pickaxe rose and fell, breaking the compacted earth. Then the shovel, scooping the loosened dirt and rock into the wheelbarrow. Each full load was a victory, wheeled 50 feet away and dumped to form a growing berm that would later be used to further insulate the northern wall. The men of the town, occupied with their own desperate efforts to fell green timber, would occasionally see her toiling on the hillside. Silas Croft, hauling a meager load of unseasoned pine, stopped and watched for a full 10 minutes. "Look at her," he said to his companion. "Digging her own grave, it seems. A sad thing what grief does to a mind." They shook their heads and moved on, their pity as misplaced as their confidence. They saw a grieving girl engaged in a fool's errand. They did not see the methodical execution of a brilliant plan. For 14 days, Ilara worked from sunup to sundown. Her hands, soft from a year of solitary domesticity, became calloused, then blistered, then raw. The blisters broke, bled, and hardened into a second skin of pure resilience. Her back ached with a fire that never fully extinguished, and her shoulders screamed in protest each morning. But she did not stop. She measured her progress not in days, but in cubic feet of earth moved. The pit grew deeper, its sharp, geometric lines a testament to her singular vision. She unearthed stones, some as large as bread loaves, and carefully set them aside. These were not obstacles, they were building materials. By October 20th, the excavation was complete. The hole in the ground was a stark, impressive wound in the hillside. It was precisely 12 feet wide, 24 feet long, and sloped from a depth of 4 feet in the front to 8 feet in the back. She had moved, by her own calculation, over 2,000 cubic feet of earth and rock, one shovelful at a time. She stood at the edge, breathing heavily in the thin, cold air, and felt not exhaustion, but a profound sense of accomplishment. The foundation of her survival was laid. The next phase required a different kind of labor. The stones she had salvaged from the dig needed to become walls. She had no money for cement, but her grandfather's journal offered an alternative, a traditional lime mortar. She hitched her late husband's aging mule Bartholomew to a small cart and made the 7-mile journey to the limestone deposits at the far end of the valley. She spent 2 days quarrying the chalky rock and another 2 building a makeshift kiln, a process detailed with chemical precision in the journal. She burned the limestone with scavenged wood, a slow, hot fire that transformed it into quicklime. It was a dangerous process, requiring care and patience. When it was done, she slaked the lime with water, watching it hiss and steam, creating a putty that, when mixed with sand from the creek bed, would form a durable, breathable mortar. With her mortar prepared, she began the painstaking work of building the retaining walls. The north, east, and west walls were her target. The south would remain open, waiting for its wall of glass. She was not a stonemason, but she was a meticulous student. She chose each stone with care, fitting them together like pieces of an intricate puzzle. The largest, flattest stones formed the base, laid in a trench dug below the frost line. She filled the gaps with smaller stones and generous amounts of her homemade mortar. The walls rose slowly, a few inches each day. They were not perfectly uniform, but they were strong, solid, and thick. 18 inches thick. This was the heart of the design, the thermal mass. These walls, coupled with the surrounding earth, would act as a massive heat sink, absorbing the sun's energy during the day and slowly releasing it through the cold, dark night. While she worked, the valley's premature winter deepened. The temperature rarely rose above freezing, even at midday. The communal woodpile in the center of town was already shrinking at an alarming rate. The smoke that rose from the town's chimneys was thin and acrid, the smell of green wood that gave more smoke than heat. The faces of the townspeople grew more gaunt, their conversations shorter, their tempers thinner. They had no time for Alara's folly now. They were too consumed by their own. By mid-November, the stone walls were complete, reaching up to ground level. Now came the most critical and expensive part of the project, the roof and the southern glazing. For this, she needed lumber and glass. She took $30 of her precious silver and rode Bartholomew to the small, struggling lumber mill downstream. She did not buy the thick, milled logs the townsmen favored. Instead, she purchased rough-sawn dimensional lumber, 4x6 beams for the rafters and 1-inch planks for the sheathing. They were cheaper and, for her design, far more suitable. The glass was a greater challenge. She wrestled the heavy beams into place herself, using a simple but effective system of levers and fulcrums. It was slow, dangerous work, a dance of balance and strength. Once the rafters were secured, she began the delicate process of creating her glass wall. She built a sturdy frame between the rafters on the southern face, meticulously measuring and cutting the wood to fit her salvaged panes. Each piece of glass was cleaned, set in a bed of glazing putty she made from linseed oil and chalk, and secured with tiny metal points. It was a patchwork quilt of glass, but when it was finished, it was airtight and beautiful. Light flooded into the sunken space, illuminating the rich, dark earth and the cool, gray stone. The northern half of the roof was a different matter entirely. Here, insulation, not light, was the goal. She laid down the thick wooden planks, followed by a layer of tarred felt she had bartered for. On top of this, she shoveled a thick, 2-foot layer of the earth she had excavated, tamping it down firmly. Finally, she laid sod, harvested from the meadow, over the entire earthen roof. When spring came, it would grow, blending the structure almost seamlessly into the hillside. It was a living roof, a blanket of earth that would provide an incredible R-value of insulation that no shingled roof could ever match. The final piece of the interior was the stove. She did not install a massive open hearth like the ones in the town's cabins, which sent 80% of their heat straight up the chimney. She used the last of her money, a total of $17, to purchase a small, cast-iron Franklin stove from a traveling merchant. It was compact, efficient, and could be precisely controlled with a flue damper. She installed it against the north stone wall, running a narrow stovepipe up through the earthen roof. The design was intentional. The stovepipe would radiate its own heat into the surrounding earth of the roof, capturing every last possible unit of thermal energy. On December 1st, 1876, nearly 2 months after she had first broken ground, the sunken hearth was complete. From the north, it was almost invisible, a mere swell in the landscape. From the south, it was a slash of glittering glass angled toward the sky. She built a heavy, insulated door into the eastern wall, set deep into the earth. She moved her few possessions from the cold, drafty cabin above: a simple rope bed, a wooden chest, a table, 2 chairs, and her grandfather's books. The final cost had been $27 for lumber and the stove, and another $5 for the salvaged glass and tar paper. The rest had been built from the land itself, from stone and earth and lime and her own unrelenting labor. That first evening, as a bitter wind howled over the valley, Alara lit a fire in the Franklin stove. She used only 3 small pieces of seasoned pine, wood she had saved from her husband's small private stash. The fire caught quickly, and within an hour, a deep, penetrating warmth filled the small space. It was not the scorching, temporary heat of an open fire, but a gentle, ambient heat that radiated from the stone walls and the earthen floor. The temperature inside climbed to a steady 68 degrees. The glass wall, which the townsmen had predicted would bleed heat, was cool to the touch on the inside, the night's cold held at bay. She banked the fire, and the warmth held. She sat at her table, the journal open before her. Outside, the wind shrieked, a sound she had always dreaded in her old cabin. Here, in the quiet, warm embrace of the earth, it was a distant, powerless thing. She had not built a hole in the ground. She had built a sanctuary. She had built a future. The first 2 weeks of December were a trial run, a period of observation and validation for Alara's creation. The sunken hearth performed not just as expected, but beyond even her grandfather's most optimistic predictions. The passive solar gain during the day was astonishing. Even on overcast days, the diffuse light that filtered through the glass wall was enough to heat the interior space significantly. On the rare sunny days, the temperature inside could climb to 75 degrees by mid-afternoon, with no fire at all. The massive thermal battery of the stone and earth absorbed this free energy, holding the ambient temperature above 60 degrees well into the night. Her fuel consumption was laughably small. The half-cord of seasoned wood her husband had left her, which would have lasted perhaps 3 weeks in her old cabin, now seemed like a supply that could last for years. She used the stove only in the early mornings to take the chill off the air, and for a few hours after sunset. A handful of kindling and 2 or 3 small logs were all that was required for an entire day. The contrast with the town was stark and growing more desperate by the day. In Providence Gulch, the reality of their situation had settled in like a terminal illness. The green wood they were forced to burn sizzled and smoked, producing frustratingly little heat and a dangerous amount of creosote in their chimneys. Families were forced to close off rooms, huddling together in a single space, their breath fogging in the frigid air. The communal woodpile was a scene of constant anxiety, with Mayor Thompson and Mr. Abernathy overseeing the doling out of meager daily rations. Tempers flared. A fistfight broke out between two neighbors over a few extra logs. The pioneer spirit Thompson had invoked was dissolving into a primal fear of freezing to death. They still spoke of Alara, but the tone had shifted from condescending pity to a kind of resentful bewilderment. They saw no smoke coming from her property, save for a thin, brief wisp in the mornings. They assumed she was either freezing in her hole or had already succumbed to some damp, subterranean illness. Silas Croft confidently proclaimed that she must be burning her furniture to stay alive. It was easier to imagine her failure than to confront the possibility of their own catastrophic error in judgment. On the morning of December 18th, Ilara awoke to a profound silence. The usual sound of the wind in the pines was gone, replaced by an unnerving stillness. The light filtering through the glass wall was a dim, gray luminescence. She rose from her bed and looked out. The world had vanished behind a solid, moving curtain of white. The snow was falling not as individual flakes, but as a thick, seamless cascade. It was a storm of a magnitude she had never seen. She lit a small fire, more for coffee than for warmth, and checked the thermometer she had hung on the wall. Inside, it was a comfortable 66 degrees. She hung a second thermometer outside, sheltered under the small overhang of the roof. By noon, it had dropped to 5 degrees below zero, and the wind had begun. It started as a low moan and built steadily into a high, violent scream. It was the dreaded northern wind, the white death of mountain lore, carrying with it the Arctic heart of the continent. In the town, panic was a tangible thing. The wind assaulted their cabins, finding every crack and chink in the log walls. It forced the smoke back down their chimneys, filling the rooms with acrid fumes. The fine, wind-driven snow was like sand, penetrating window sashes and door frames, dusting the floors with a layer of white. The battle for heat became a frantic, losing war. Wood was consumed at a terrifying rate, the fires roaring as the wind sucked the heat straight out of the structures. Mr. Abernathy sat in his own cabin, the one he considered the finest in the gulch, and felt the cold seeping through the floorboards. His log walls, 18 inches thick, felt as porous as cheesecloth against the relentless assault of the wind. He had already burned through a day's ration of wood in 3 hours, and the room was still cold enough to make his joints ache. He thought of the girl in her hole in the ground. A part of him, a small, terrified part, wondered if her earthen walls felt the wind at all. He quickly crushed the thought. It was impossible. It was madness. The storm raged for 2 full days, a continuous, deafening blizzard that buried the valley. Snowdrifts piled up against the north walls of the cabins, reaching the roof lines. The world was reduced to a howling vortex of white and gray. Inside the sunken hearth, life continued in serene normalcy. Ilara read her grandfather's books, mended her clothes, and ate her meals in the steady, quiet warmth. The storm was an abstraction, a thing heard but not felt. The temperature inside never dropped below 64 degrees. The thick blanket of snow that now covered her earthen roof only served as another layer of perfect insulation. She was the safest person in the entire valley. On the evening of the third day, December 20th, a new sound broke through the storm's monotony. It was a frantic, muffled pounding. It was coming from her door. Ilara grabbed her lantern and unbarred the heavy, insulated door. A figure stumbled in, collapsing onto the earthen floor in a cloud of snow and ice. It was Martha Croft, Silas's wife, her face pale and her lips blue. Her shawl was frozen stiff. "Help us!" she gasped, her voice a ragged whisper. "The fire! The wood is gone! Our baby! He's so cold!" Ilara did not hesitate. She helped the woman up, sat her by the stove, and wrapped her in a thick wool blanket. "Bring them here," she said, her voice calm and authoritative. "Bring the baby. Hurry." Martha stared around the room, her eyes wide with disbelief. The air was warm, almost balmy. There was no draft. The light from the lantern was soft and steady. It was an impossible haven in the heart of the maelstrom. She began to weep, tears of shock and relief. She nodded and stumbled back out into the blizzard. 20 minutes later, the door opened again. This time, it was Silas Croft, a man humbled into silence, carrying a small bundle wrapped in every blanket they owned. Martha followed, half carried by another neighbor, a young man named Peterson. His wife and 2 children were right behind him. Their wood had run out hours ago. They had been burning their chairs when Martha had volunteered to make a desperate attempt to reach Alara's place, an act born of a mother's terror. They entered the sunken hearth like refugees entering a promised land. They shed their frozen outer layers, their movements clumsy with cold. The warmth enveloped them, and the effect was immediate and overwhelming. The baby, who had been making a thin, weak cry, slowly grew quiet as the life-giving heat penetrated his swaddling. They huddled together on the floor, speechless, their earlier mockery of this place now a burning shame in their minds. "There is stew on the stove," Alara said simply, ladling the hot, thick mixture into bowls. She expected no apologies, and they offered none. The reality of their survival at her hand was apology enough. Word, it seemed, could travel even in a blizzard. Over the next few hours, more came. The Petersons had told the Abernathys, who had told the Millers. They arrived in small, desperate groups, guided by a rope they had tied between the cabins, their faces masked with ice, their bodies stiff with cold. Each time the door opened, it admitted a blast of Arctic fury, but the thermal mass of the structure was so immense that the temperature dropped only a degree or two before rebounding. Soon, there were 15 people crowded into the 24 by 12-foot space. It was cramped, but it was warm, and it was alive. Alara moved among them, a figure of quiet competence, distributing blankets and food. She was no longer the town outcast. She was their sole anchor in a world that had turned lethal. The last to arrive were Mayor Thompson and Mr. Abernathy. They looked defeated, their faces gray with exhaustion and humiliation. Abernathy's prized cabin, the symbol of his craft, had become an icebox. A chimney fire, sparked by the burning of green pine, had nearly taken the whole structure. They had fought it in the screaming wind, their hands freezing to the buckets of snow they used to douse it. They had been saved from the fire only to be sentenced to the cold. Abernathy stepped inside and stopped, his builder's eye taking in every detail. He saw the elegant simplicity of the design, the strength of the stone walls, the genius of the glass face. He saw the minimal amount of wood stacked next to the small stove, a pile no bigger than what he would have burned in a single afternoon. He looked at the thermometer, 67 degrees. He felt the warmth on his frozen face, a gentle, radiant heat that came from the very floor and walls around him. He understood. In a single, humbling moment, his lifetime of conventional wisdom crumbled into dust. He had been building monuments to pride. She had built a machine for living. He looked at Alara, who was tending to the Croft baby near the stove. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. What could he say? "I'm sorry? You were right?" The phrases were pitifully inadequate. She had not sought his approval, only his attention. She had not wanted his praise, only his reason. He had denied her both, and in doing so, had nearly condemned them all. The storm finally broke on the morning of December 22nd. The silence that descended was as profound as the blizzard's roar had been. The sun rose on a transformed world, a landscape of impossible sculptural white. The valley was buried under an average of 8 feet of snow, with drifts reaching as high as 20 feet. From the sunken hearth, now crowded with 23 souls, they began to dig their way out. The town was a disaster. Several roofs had collapsed under the weight of the snow. Livestock had frozen in the barns, and a grim discovery was made at the furthest homestead. The elderly McGregor couple, who had been unable to make it to the center of town, were found frozen in their beds. Their woodpile had been exhausted on the second day. The sunken hearth became the de facto town hall, hospital, and command center. Its warmth was a beacon of life. Its stores of food, though simple, were shared among all. The irony was lost on no one. The structure they had ridiculed as a grave had become their cradle, their only shield against the one they had dug for themselves. In the days that followed, a new social order quietly emerged. Mayor Thompson's booming pronouncements were replaced by quiet, practical questions directed at Ilara. Mr. Abernathy, his pride stripped away, became her most devoted student, studying her grandfather's journals with the intensity of a novice monk. He asked her about convection, about thermal mass, about the precise angle of the sun in January. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked for knowledge. The men of the town, chastened and humbled, looked at her with a new reverence. They saw not a grieving girl, but a leader. Not a purveyor of foolish dreams, but a vessel of essential, forgotten wisdom. They had built their world to fight the wilderness, to conquer it through brute force and stubbornness. Ilara, guided by her grandfather's legacy, had shown them that survival was not about fighting nature, but about understanding and harmonizing with its immutable laws. One evening, a week after the storm, Mr. Abernathy sat with Ilara at her small table, tracing the diagrams in the journal with a calloused, trembling finger. "All my life," he said, his voice low and heavy with the weight of his revelation, "I've been building boxes, cold boxes. I thought the thicker the log, the stronger the man. I never once thought about the earth. I never once looked at the sun as anything more than a light in the sky. He saw it as a furnace." Ilara simply nodded, allowing him the space for his contrition. Her victory was not in their shame, but in their education. Her vindication was not a gloating triumph, but the quiet, profound satisfaction of seeing the seed of an idea, once scorned, finally take root in the minds of her people. The winter was far from over, but now they had a blueprint for survival. Next spring, they would not be rebuilding their cold, inefficient cabins. They would be digging. They would be building winter houses, sunken hearths, all of them. Providence Gulch would survive, not because of the strength of its pioneers, but because of the wisdom of the quiet 20-year-old widow they had once called crazy.